Hello and welcome to the 35th episode of Tailoring in Conversation. My name is Reza, and in this series I'll be talking to tailors, business owners, cloth merchants, and other industry participants from all around the globe to gain a better insight into their worlds. My guest for today is Jeffery Diduch, joining us from New York. Most of us know Jeffrey from his blog, Tuttofattoamano, in which he shared his research by dissecting both bespoke and factory garments, but also documenting his own personal projects. He's now the Senior Vice President of Design at Hickey Freeman and Samuelson. In our conversation today, we're going to be talking about the differences between bespoke and mass production, upcoming technologies, innovation, and much more. Let's go. Jeffrey, as you know, as I've just told you, I've got a tremendous amount of respect for you. And I was first introduced by a friend of mine who is also a tailor to your blog back in 2014. And I just started tailoring and we were kind of like struggling with buttonholes. And he said, you have to look at this blog, and there's this guy, he makes perfect buttonholes and he uses GIMP. And I was like, what the hell is GIMP? And so we were kind of like looking at all these posts that you were putting out there. And then later on, when I went on Savile Row, you were the guy who rips shit open and exposes the crap inside them. That's what I was kind of like told. So thank you very much for spending the time with me. How are you doing, first of all?
I'm doing well. I've never been busier. It was for 2 years of COVID when nobody was wearing tailored clothing. It was tough for us, and we were all wondering what was going to happen when we came out. As everybody's used to wearing their pajamas, that nobody's going to want to dress up anymore. And we're finding that now, after 2 years of pajamas, people are ready to dress up, and so we've had a really intense reopening.
I can imagine. My friend Matthew did an interview with you on the Common Threads podcast where he asked you about your background and where you came from, what you did, and I will certainly be promoting that once this interview gets out. But just very briefly, because you're mostly famous for your buttonholes, as you say, but on your blog, but also for your blog.
So actually, my husband wrote that on it. He's sort of the administrator of that stuff now, and he was poking fun at me, and I was like, "Take that down." He said, "No, I'm leaving it up."
Well, I can understand that. That's fine. If for the people who haven't been following anything beyond your blog, can you very briefly just describe how you got into the industry, what your main chapters were, and what you're doing now, and then we'll dive into some of the topics that I'd like to cover with you.
Tailoring's been in my family for many generations, and my mother taught me to sew at a very young age. It was mostly just a way to keep me busy and keep me out of trouble. But as I grew up, I enjoyed it. I was fascinated by it, especially about the very sculptural elements of tailoring. I was very heavily influenced by the early work of Balenciaga and some of the early couturiers. Just the fit and the shape that they could achieve fascinated me. So I think I was around 14 years old when I made my first tuxedo, and sewing and making clothes was to be a hobby for me. I was going to be a musician. Long story, I ended up changing directions, and instead of doing music, I decided to do clothing. Ended up in Montreal to do an internship after school in order to finish school, and by accident ended up at Samuelson, which was a maker of full canvas tailored clothing that I had been aware of for quite a while because I had found a jacket made by them in a thrift shop. And while I had stuff from Armani and Boss and Versace and all sorts of other things, there was something special about this garment. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't tell you why. It fit better and it felt better, and it was just a lot of things. And so when some people came to where I was working and said, our boss, the production manager at Samuelson, wants to meet you because they had seen that I was making a suit for myself. It was, I don't know, it was a special little moment of fate that I accidentally ended up in the tailored clothing, ready-to-wear industry, and have been doing that for 26, 27 years now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy that it happened because I do believe that at the very least for people who like me who started fairly like just a few years ago, your blog was has had a lot of impact, and not necessarily, you know, as a book page to page would have impact, but just the fact that someone is out there thinking about how and why things are made the way they are, and has the curiosity of, I don't know, a 4 year old. And so, you know, reading through your blog, and I reread it in the last week just to kind of like refresh my memory, how you wrote or write about the things that you're unpicking and opening up and kind of like working on doesn't sound like someone who knows it all and is just opening stuff to criticize. It's really like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I should try this out. So, were you like this as a younger kid, and or as a musician even, or you know, do your younger friends know you like the person who questioned everything and was very curious?
So I didn't really fully realize this about myself and where it came from until recently, when my husband said, "Well, your sister's the same way. You're both researchers." And
Mm-hmm.
my father was an engineer with the National Research Council of Canada. And
Right.
so we grew up going to see him at work where they had wind tunnels and wave tanks and stuff where they studied things and they did
Mm-hmm.
experiments. And he would bring things home from work to play with long before they were publicly available. And so I was exposed to all sorts of stuff as a
Mm-hmm.
kid, and just the concept, the curiosity. And if you want to know about something, my dad seemed to have all the answers, but he wouldn't give them to us. He would teach us how to find the answers.
Lovely.
Um,
Mm.
and so, while my mother taught me how to sew, my father taught me how to be curious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, it's no secret that in the industry we look at other people's garments, we study them, we always have. And I just at one point thought, well, I mean, if I'm doing this, maybe somebody else would benefit from it. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was between that and discovering Ask Andy and Style Forum right
Mm-hmm.
around the time that I started blogging. And I feel bad that I haven't written much of anything for a long time, because people still send me garments to look at, and I look at them and they're interesting, but it takes a lot of time to do those
Yeah.
posts.
Yeah. Yeah.
It takes a
I
lot
can
of time.
imagine. Yeah. Yeah. You need an assistant to unpick things for you, I believe.
Well, I'm working on that. I'm working on that. And there may be some videos coming, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah,
there's
that's very
definitely,
good.
it felt like I'd stopped talking or I had nothing left to say, which wasn't entirely true. It's just I didn't have the time to put it out
Mm-hmm.
in format. I look back and I was like, oh, I couldn't even be bothered to spell check back then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I can imagine if you as you're kind of like developing and your knowledge compounds and you're engaged in projects that take a lot of thought work and a lot of energy, that perhaps you're not in the moment as you were unpicking those things, but you're maybe like 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, thinking through all the projects that you're involved with. So I can understand if you're like, well, yeah, you know, opening another lapel, you know, what's that going to do? I've seen like probably like a few hundred of them, even though your curiosity may not have been disappearing. Um, what I find interesting about you is that you're kind of like a mediator, and I don't know if that's the right word, but you're kind of like in the middle between mass production and tradition. And so you are aware and you know very well the traditional bespoke tailoring techniques on multiple garments, but you're also someone who's spent an extensive amount of time on factory floors. So, and we both know that since like the industrial revolution, people have just had this tension between automation and things that are handmade and have a soul and are humane and whatsoever. I don't know much about manufacturing and the people behind it, but I'm sure you can at least shed some light on this. Who are the people, and I mean professionally, from with a background? Who are the people behind the designing of processes that create automated garments? Who designs the machinery? Who designs the processes? What sort of background do they have? And so let's take it from there, and we'll see how that develops.
That would be a combination of people, someone like myself, who's the pattern designer, and a person or team of industrial engineers who study ergonomics, who study movement, who are trained in these things. Um, it began in the late 1800s and really hit its heyday in the early 1900s. And a lot of the machines that we use now were designed back then. There hasn't been a lot of real newness since then. There have been improvements and things have become computerized, but a lot of it was done back then where there was this explosion of, I don't even know what to call it. And a lot of it was centered right here in the United States, in particular here in Higgy Freeman. So it's where we get together and either creatively, I said, this is, something I want to achieve. How do we do it efficiently and consistently? And that's where, the quality team and the engineers will all get together and study it and say, okay, what's the best way of doing this?
Would you say that the majority of those people you've worked with who are involved in those projects are people with a tailoring background per se, like a traditional tailoring background?
Most, if not all, of the good quality people, and by quality people I mean the vice president of quality, had gone to the tailor shop at the age of 12 back in Italy, sort of thing. They had that background. And then the engineers, they came out of engineering school with engineering degrees. How they ended up in the clothing industry, search me. You'd have to ask them. They didn't necessarily have a background in tailored clothing or in any kind of clothing, but just industrial processes.
I see. And what would you say were, at least from your experience and your observation, what were the main differences between the ones who did have a tailoring background in their thinking and the working out of some process that would be able to sustain itself? What were the differences in their thinking between the traditional tailors or people with a tailoring background and those who were just pure engineers, mechanical, thinking things through, in all the smallest details?
Well, I think maybe a more apt comparison is so I have some friends who worked at Bombardier, the plane maker, and they were always stunned at the amount of time and the amount of effort that went into our manufacturing and how complicated it could be. And they're like, that's not complicated. We make planes. That's complicated. Until I said, yeah, but when you make a plane, your piece of metal is not moving, it's not changing, it's not shifting, and it's consistent, and it's the same from day to day, and the same size, and same shape, and same everything. When you're making clothing, it's different cloth, different shape. There's things that change and go wrong and shift, and all sorts of stuff happening, and you can't just mechanize a process like that where every time you do exactly the same thing. And so people who had that sort of understanding, especially, the top management that I've worked in that had backgrounds who grew up in the industry because their parents had factories or tailor shops, they were always the best ones. Like I always felt that, people who'd sat down on a sewing machine in their lives were the ones that sort of really truly understood and could better manage, even if it was just, managing people within the place.
I see. And one of the things I've always been curious about is when you are about to design, let's say, some sort of a new sewing machine, or you're about to design a sewing machine that does a very particular, performs a particular part on the garment, like a color machine or a sleeve machine or a padding machine. Obviously, a big team of just pure engineers are behind, the mechanics of that and the workings. But I assume that if you are, for example, designing a sleeve machine, you also have to understand, at least to some degree, the whole anatomy or the mechanics of a sleeve, to kind of like design around that. How many of those machines are designed with tailors involved, let's say, than just pure engineers?
All of them. I mean, you can't make a machine like that without involvement. In fact, I was working with our engineers this week, on specifically sleeve setting machines. And they
Right.
wanted to understand, okay, how much fullness are you putting in where, like as a percentage or a value? Because it's not consistent. You don't just say, okay, I'm putting in 2 inches of fullness and just spread it out evenly around the whole armhole. There's a
Yes.
certain amount here, a different amount here, a different amount here, and so I had to give them an understanding of how much I want where, so that they can set up the programs and the amount that the belt feeds, so I get the results that I want.
Right, right. So from what I'm understanding now, based on the few answers you've given, is that there is a team of engineers who does the main engineering, but they are always in close communication with the tailors, so that they know what it is that they are eventually engineering, and they take their cues from the tailors, but the actual engineering is done by the engineers. Is that roughly the kind of like idea there?
Most often, but it's not, restricted to that. For example, right now we're working on algorithms to draft patterns based on body scans and body measurements. And as I think about, the traditional drafting methods and the limitations to them, and I think about how better to capture the human form, and is there different ways to analyze measurement, I'm starting to think up different contraptions that I would need to build in order to capture certain measurements, or, accurately represent that. And then I think through, well, it's difficult in real life because people are moving around, and to establish landmarks that could shift, or if I had them in 3D and it's static and I actually can put markings, or I can split them up, or I can make their arm disappear, or do all sorts of things, it opens up a whole new world. So in a sense, instead of designing machines right now, I'm designing software, maybe, which is just an extension of it.
I see, I see. And would you say that you're now using most of your, in the process of, for example, working on a software, are you mainly using your tailoring knowledge, or are you using your engineering knowledge and the new knowledge maybe that you're kind of like learning as you're progressing into these projects?
I see the craft of tailoring as a specific form of engineering. So I don't see them as distinct. It's all one and the same to me.
Yes, yes, yes. I understand. I understand.
In fact, I remember seeing, I'm pretty sure it was you, in fact, and I don't know where I saw it, but I think you were discussing the shaping of a shoulder pad for a pagoda shoulder, and I thought, I like the way this guy thinks. Like it was very similar to how I approach problems.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that it is engineering. You see, there is one thing I've noticed is that there are artisans who don't necessarily see the process that they perform as engineering, in the sense that, look, engineering is not per se a process. It's everything can be decomposed as it's an element on its own, right? And you could, I think I read this on your blog. It was like, you make up a bunch of rules, and if the rules don't work, you make new rules. That's, someone said that to you, I believe.
Yep.
And so I think when you have a foundation of thinking like that, you don't create holy boundaries around a given process. So the reason why I'm kind of like going back and forth on tailoring, engineering, and a little bit looking at them separately, is that when I speak to tailors, and not all of them, but some of them, they think that engineering on itself is just something to do with mechanical processes, where the dynamics that you're describing that clothing has, one day the fabric is different, or where that dynamic landscape isn't there. They just see it like, look, these are a few processes, they work on everything, they work on all fabrics, they work on all figures. You just do that, and don't mess around with how you could turn this flap more efficiently. Now, I understand that's a bit closed-minded thinking, or a severe respect to the process that they've been taught. But there is a point in the tension of, look, if we are going to have this whole engineering of tailored garments, and we're going to have all these automated machines, what is going to be left of the craft that we are performing? As traditional handcrafted artisan or handcraft tailors. You know what I mean? So having been in both worlds, if we get to a point where all the garments are at least brought to a level of sophistication where you can't see a difference between a tailored garment, a handmade tailored garment, and a machine-made garment, what does that mean for the traditional bespoke tailor? What does it say about their work?
Oh, I have so much I would love to say on that subject in response to that question. But I'll start by saying, in fact, I won't say it. Peter Thiel said it in his book 0 to 1. Something to the effect of Google making headlines because their supercomputers were able to recognize a picture of a cat with 75% accuracy by looking at YouTube thumbnails. And everybody was very impressed until someone said, yeah, but any 4-year-old can do that with 100% accuracy. So what?
Yeah.
And his point was that humans are very good at certain things and not so good at others, and machines are very good at certain things and not so good at others. So why attempt to fully automate certain things that would be so difficult to do when instead you could harness the skills of both and make them complementary and get better results. And the same can be said of tailoring, is that at a certain point, when does it not make sense to try to automate something? When do we need the human's ability to evaluate and adjust on the fly? I also think that as things become more mechanized, and we've already seen it in the last 10, 15 years, as things become more the same, there's the backlash to it, where people are more interested in things that aren't the same, that aren't cranked out of factories and that look very, very consistent. It's why, the unevenness of hand stitching has become appealing. There's a lot of talk about the metaverse and the effects this will have on the fashion industry, and discussion about doing things. Oh, it's great because we can do stuff in 3D that we could never be able to make in real life. And a lot of people were saying, well, where does that leave us in the real world? Are we all going to end up in pods like in the Matrix, where because it's so fascinating in the metaverse, nobody will want to pay attention to real life? And I think the opposite will happen, because as we're talking about doing garments and things and effects in 3D that you couldn't do in real life, I think a backlash will occur where it'll be something to say, well, yes, I can accomplish this in real life. Sure, you can make a perfect fit in 3D, but can you do that in real life? Or can you actually craft a shoulder, like a pagoda shoulder in real life? Can you do it with your hands and so I think that will create a similar kind of backlash, like the whole sort of craft everything that in the last 15 years that we've seen.
Do you think that if the metaverse at some point develops to such extent that you have all the types of different clothing shops that you can have and all the different skins and suits people can kind of like download, do you think that that's going to be, like you say, bring such a backlash that people say, look, we're now really not into the real world? And so at the same time, the real world kind of like starts to gain more of a weight than it did maybe like 20 years ago. So then to that extreme, where do you then see ready to wear and made to measure between the real world handmade stuff and the metaverse? What happens to the factory made garment then? Does it run a risk of some sorts?
So I don't think ready to wear will exist in 10 years, maybe sooner. I don't know. What's the point of it if we can get to the point where we can efficiently manufacture something that will fit you better and that is really what you want in the right colors and right everything, that we're not making it advance so that we've got leftover and we have waste. And it really doesn't make any sense. It means that manufacturers have to get better at on-demand production. It means that there's enormous pressure on supply chains. It also means maybe that we see reshoring, because if I'm ordering something, maybe it's easier and faster to have it made near me. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're so used to ordering from Amazon and getting it in 2 days or next day.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't want to wait 6 weeks for something to come from overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. Maybe shipping will improve to such an extent that it still makes sense to manufacture in other places, faraway places. I don't know. But yeah, I think it will have a big effect on the industry. And I think quite the reverse. I mean, so 15, 20 years ago, we were lamenting the loss of, there were no people learning tailoring. There were no young kids. The tailor shops had gone away. There was a real brain drain, and there was a real sort of, there's no next generation. And so it's really encouraging to me to meet people like you, and you mentioned Matthew Paluzzo and other younger people that are interested in the craft and interested in learning to make things with their hands and make things themselves. And it's not something that we saw just a few years ago. So I find it very encouraging.
Yes, it is. That's definitely true, and we see it in different industries as well. Other industries are also starting to pay more attention to things that are handmade. So, and also like with food industry as well, everything has to be organic. Everything has to be you need to know who
Farm
grew
to
them.
table. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, what sort of a time frame do you see for the development of made to measure, or as I called it a few days ago, made to figure? To reach such a level where it's pretty much bespoke. It just isn't made by your local tailor or your personal tailor, but you could say the figuration is nailed to the millimeter. It's exactly, or perhaps even better in terms of fit, and I believe production as well, than something that a normal regular personal tailor would do. What is the time frame for that to reach that, you think?
I would have said just 2 years ago, we were much further away. And you may not know that my first experience with sort of body scanning and this kind of technology was 12 or 13 years ago already, where we started body scanning for made to measure, and things progressed at a relative snail's pace. The pandemic occurred at a time where, it just so happened that a lot of things came together to push technology further, including crypto mining using graphics cards. So suddenly there's a giant market for GPUs that are used in 3D, and just, the pandemic making everybody go virtual and think about how do we fit and how do we make things without physically being in the same room. So it's sped it up exponentially. So I'm not even sure when, but it could be within 6 months or a year. It's moving that fast.
Wow.
I'm working on some projects that we had started beta testing before the pandemic that we're about to get very aggressive in terms of testing on real bodies again, but it's going to happen real fast.
Testing on real bodies sounds more severe than it actually is. It sounds like you're about to do some chip implant or something.
Well, it's very different either doing in 3D or doing it on forms. I have several different sizes of Alvenon forms in my studio, and I'll do things like, pad out the breasts to drape things to see how the pattern has to change as the breast gets larger or smaller, stuff like this. But that's still a very controlled environment, and it's very, very different when it's actually a human bone and flesh, soft and malleable, and they change. So it's a totally different thing than sort of the theoretical exercise.
In that process of, so imagine that the technology is there. You can have all the algorithms that one needs to develop a perfect pattern for any type of figure. But then you also have the market response. You have all the marketing of that. You have the consumer side of, okay, what is their interaction? How do they get to that? All of those connections. What do you think are the biggest challenges from bringing a technology that is developed, like let's say in the lab, to the market, so that the market can interact with it in ways that it doesn't mess around? Because some technologies are made in such way that if the end user doesn't use it correctly, the technology kind of like doesn't fully work. What are some of the challenges there, you think? Will it be
The,
just as easy as going online and just doing a scan, or can we scan it with our phones? Do we need like machine? What is the infrastructure looking like?
well, so the whole scanning was one of the things that was a big barrier, because in order to get
Mm-hmm.
accurate results, you needed these big,
Mm-hmm.
expensive booth scanners. Like when we bought them 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I think they were $200,000 a piece,
Wow.
and very difficult to put up and take down
Mm-hmm.
and travel with. And we knew that phone scanning was going to come, and it's now, I mean, it's not perfect and there's issues, but for many cases, it's good enough
Mm-hmm.
to make clothing off of, and it will continue to improve. But um, the big impediments are not just consumers, and getting consumers to understand it and trust it,
Mm-hmm.
and want to do it. And as one of our ecom people say, our customers think email is cutting edge and have trouble with their shopping cart. So you think they're going to scan themselves with a phone?
Mm-hmm.
But also just us as an industry saying we've always done it this way. We've done this way for 130 years, like getting people to change their thinking about stuff,
Mm-hmm.
changing legacy systems,
Mm-hmm.
especially, a lot of the manufacturers that are left have been around for a long time. We
Mm-hmm.
have software that was installed in 1982, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
We want to
Wow.
bring in new technology, but it
Mm-hmm.
can't interface with the legacy systems. So what do we do
Mm-hmm.
about it? It's it's a heavy lift.
One thing I'm curious about is, so people buy clothes every day, and if you really take the population, the majority of people, they don't really complain that much about the fit of their clothing, because generally patterns are okay, unless you have a professional eye and you're like seeing everything that's wrong. But the average person worldwide has enough choice and enough shops to go to find something that fits them, or suits them well. What is really the benefit for companies who are selling these products? Because I can understand, if you develop something like a technology like that, I'm going to be really happy, because then I can buy all my clothing and it's going to be a perfect fit. I'm not going to be fussy anymore about why this is pulling that way or that way. But for the person or the company that needs to manufacture this, and they're doing fine, they're selling enough, they're making millions of profit a year, why on earth should I go for a fancy algorithm? And I'm not opposed to this. I'm just putting like a devil's advocate hat on. Why on earth should a company go for a fancy algorithm that satisfies a perfect fit need for a smaller segment of the population, when they have to change, like you say, all the legacy software and all the machines that are maybe not compatible with it, make new investments and all of that? What is it in for them, would you say?
I won't quote specific numbers because I don't know them.
Sure.
Um, but all you need to do is look at, for example, the return rates on ecom for clothing, which are somewhere in the range of 50%,
Mm-hmm.
and what it costs to companies when a consumer will order 3 of something to keep one and send the other 2 back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also the amount of waste produced by the fashion industry by producing clothes that never end up being sold. By
Correct.
eliminating these things and by
Mm-hmm.
learning to produce, because of course, to produce 60,000 of something, you can do it very, very efficiently and fast. To produce
Mm-hmm.
one of something that's individualized is not.
Mm-hmm.
But to rethink the way that you manufacture and sell in order
Mm-hmm.
to accommodate the one, to be centered
Mm-hmm.
around the single unit rather than the 60,000 of something,
Mm-hmm.
and make your processes efficient to do that one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that, in my opinion, is the future. And if you don't get on board with that, you
Mm-hmm.
won't be in business for very long.
I see. So the main point, it really is waste management. That's really the main aspect of it.
Waste in terms of clothing, but also waste in terms of money and shipping and time and
Of
waste in
course, yes.
general.
Yes, okay, yeah, of course. Waste will then eventually result in the money you're losing as well.
I mean, I hate the word sustainability because it's become so overused, and
Yeah.
we're talking about greenwashing, but it really is about
Mm-hmm.
sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. And you said that maybe in the next 6 months that technology can already be available, as that's going really fast, developing really fast. Do you think the transition period for a lot of companies to take on a technology like that is going to be equally fast, or do we need another 10 years with the companies to just take that on board?
I think it will be a few of us will come out early with
Mm-hmm.
things, and we've
Mm-hmm.
already tried. And the problem with some of this is, like, when we came out with the body scanners and we tried it and it was a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people said we tried it once, it was horrible, we'll never touch it again. And you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah,
3D, and they're
yeah,
like, oh.
yeah, yeah.
But the thing is, with this kind of technology, you've got to use it. You've got to fail. You've got to be okay with
Mm-hmm.
failing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the companies that are making the scanners and the scanning software
Mm-hmm.
aren't mind readers,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know how I'm going to use the end product of the scan. So I need to use it and try to use it in my work, and then give them the feedback saying,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is where I have problems, so that they can improve.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real challenge, sort of making a use case in a company saying, I need to spend money on a tool that doesn't even work, and won't
Mm-hmm.
even work, and won't be commercialized for another 5 years, just because I need to help them make it better so that someday
Mm-hmm.
it will work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're in that process right now, where we're actively working with companies that make the scanners or make the computer software or make the things, and say, this is what I need
Mm-hmm.
to make me successful. And
Mm-hmm.
then once it's come onto the market and shown that it works, and that the consumers start to believe in it and trust in it, and other
Mm-hmm.
companies start to believe and trust in it, then other people will get on board. It
Mm-hmm.
just takes a few leaders,
Yeah.
and then everybody else starts to run.
I see. I see. Okay. Okay. Now, learning in a tailoring shop, the techniques that are traditionally used, and kind of like going through an apprenticeship, I noticed that there was a lot of emphasis on um, things are done as they've always been done. I hate to say the sentence because it makes me sound just very cliche, but there is a truth to that. There is a reason why things are done the way they are done forever. That's the whole point of tradition. Some things remind us of certain dangers that if we deviate from them, things will go wrong. So be safe and just do what's always been done. Um, but I thought that that was just unique to maybe one or two shops. But I very quickly noticed that many shops have this approach, and the younger generation that is learning in those shops kind of like also takes on board those traits, let's say. And I understand that a whole large part of it is time is money. When you become a coat maker, trouser maker, whatsoever, you really don't have time to mess around with, like, thinking how you can fold something nicer, or make it, get the money, pay your rent, pay your whatever, feed your family. What I'd like to know is, why, first of all, do factories innovate? And what are the driving factors for them to innovate? Is it just purely economics? Or are there other factors that force them, almost create a necessity, an urgent necessity for them to innovate? And when they do innovate, what should I imagine the process of innovating within a small part of the factory? Maybe changing of machinery or changing of a schedule or whatsoever. How does that look like? Who leads those projects? Who are the leaders? Who's the person who initiates all of that? Your
Wow.
smile, your smile tells me you have a lot of answers.
Oh, I have a lot of answers.
Please shoot.
Because that's a really big, big, big question and statement. And it's so, back when I was at Samuelson, and
Mm-hmm.
Samuelson was doing things the way that they had done them for a long time, and the only time they had ever changed the way they were doing it, because either Xenia or Canali was doing something new, and they went, "Oh, we better do that too." Um, but it was still very much the same way that things had been done for a very long time.
Yeah.
And my mentor at the time had the foresight to tell me that you need to go out in the world and see that there's a lot of different ways to make things. Mm-hmm. At the high level, at the low level, in between. And after you've gone out and spent many years seeing different ways of doing things, then you'll be ready to come back. Mm-hmm. And man, was he right. And I left there and went to a company that was importing from factories all over the world. So all of a sudden I found myself on a plane going literally around the world until you end up at home, mm-hmm. seeing factories all over the place and seeing 100 different ways and ways I'd never imagined of doing things. And it really put the whole la legge questa, this is the way to do it, on its ear. And so, that was my indoctrination into the idea that things can be done differently, whether it's for economics, whether it's to get a better result, whether it's make things faster, easier, cheaper, or just different. We're constantly doing that. This week we were playing with sleeve heads and just the different combinations of materials and foam and felt and this and that and canvas. And I mean, there's no magic recipe. There's no definitive answer to anything in all this. It's all subjective. And, you were asking about, well, who leads this? Change management is tough, mm-hmm. especially in factories, especially with tools, mm-hmm. where you go on a factory floor and say, either I want you to sew this differently now. Mm-hmm. I can't do that. What are you talking about? Or I want you to use this new tool, or I want to take away that tool you're using and give you something different. And very often it's met with, it's impossible. It can't be done. What are you saying? And so to lead that process mm-hmm. can be a real challenge. What's fun is often 6 months later, you go back and say, this new thing that I gave you, I'm going to take away it now. And they're like, no, you can't. I can't live without it. I guess it's just having gone through that. And in my career, one thing that helped a lot, especially when I was traveling to those other countries and trying to get them to do something different. Mm-hmm. Because they'd be like, well, if you think it can be done, show me. And to be able to sit down at a machine and actually show them and teach them yourself. Because not only, it shows them, yes, it is possible, but they're a lot less likely to argue with you next time you ask them to do something.
Yes. Yeah.
So, for me, it was absolutely critical that I could sit down and do every single operation in a factory myself. And then that gives me the confidence of leading that change. Because typically, if I'm asking for something different, it's because I've sat down on a sewing machine or at a press and I've done it a few times in different ways to see the easiest way and most consistent way I could figure out of doing it. So it wasn't just some caprice. I'm not just saying, let's do this differently just because I feel like it, but there's a reason.
Would you say that, well, let me ask it another way. Who do you think, on a factory floor, let's say, on a bigger scale, who do you think will be probably the most resistant to any form of change? Would you say it's the people, like the 5,000 people?
The accountants.
The accountants.
The most resistant are usually the people on the machines themselves, because they get used to doing something some way. They're comfortable. In factories, most of them have some kind of incentive program where they're on some kind of piecework or bonus scale where the more they make and the less mistakes they make, the more money they may take home. And so they want to protect what they see as their skill and their money and their output. So when you ask them to do something different, it's very frightening.
Yes, well, I imagine, it takes away your edge now, because it took me like 6 months to do this really quickly, and now I have to go back and be less productive. What the hell? So, okay, so having the right incentives in the right place, I guess, helps. How much realistically? So, I don't know if well, I assume you've been following multiple companies throughout the years with whom you've been working. what has been the average rate of innovation? And by innovation, I mean a process changed, or something got completely eliminated, or something new got completely introduced. What was the average rate of factories introducing something, reshuffling something throughout the years?
We're constantly doing it. I mean,
Constantly.
that's 50% of my job. We're
Right.
constantly adapting, and maybe it's not necessarily new, but new to
Mm-hmm.
us, or a different
Mm-hmm.
approach, or slightly, it's maybe not completely out of thin air
Mm-hmm.
innovation, but
Mm-hmm.
we're constantly, because we have new fabrics, new finishes, new things all the time
Mm-hmm.
that we've never sewn before, we've never seen before. Every single day, there's something on the sewing floor that is new to us, that something's going on
Mm-hmm.
and we don't know how to fix it. We need to address it. So it's
Mm-hmm.
constant. You learn something new every single day.
Mm-hmm. 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 Do you think that when a company starts to innovate, like you say, they make a change because Xenia did it, or I don't know, Berluti did it, or whatsoever. Do you think that when you have a lot of competition and every company is doing something else, that automatically forces everyone to innovate, or do you think no, some just simply won't budge? They just stay and stick to what they have done.
There are some that just stick to what they've done because they're good at it, and because that's what they do. There's not a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
um, but in the industry, in any given sector, you're always watching your competition's trying to evolve, is trying to improve, is doing stuff. You've got to stay abreast of what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
um, and what the market is demanding, and otherwise you get left
Mm-hmm.
in the dust.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. Yeah, 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 yeah. And so, what is the? Do those factories also have like a training program, like a school where if you want to work there, you first have to learn the entire process in their way? Or do they just learn on the work floor?
It depends on the factory, depends on the level of production. Most of the higher end factories, yes, they have a training school or a training period,
Mm-hmm.
um, where you go through. When I started at Samuelson, I had to learn all the operations. That wasn't necessarily typical,
Mm-hmm.
um, but definitely there's an evaluation period. Some more industrial ones, you come in and the engineers and people study your hands, study your dexterity, study how you handle, like there's pegboards and stuff that we give them
Mm-hmm.
to sort of watch the fingers and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you'd be good at this or you'd be good at that. And then we give them training in specific areas.
Right.
Um, it's, and some people come in and it's clear they're just an operator and they'll just do an operation. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and then other people come in and I go, there may be potential here. We haven't discovered it. They haven't discovered
Mm-hmm.
it. They're not sure what they're good at yet. So let's take them through a lot of things and just
Mm-hmm.
watch and see where they
Mm-hmm.
flourish.
Right. Right. I guess spotting talent on that scale is just a complete different is a whole operation by itself, right?
So I was helping put up a factory in Mexico,
Mm.
and we were on the side of a mountain, where there were sheep and goats and not much else, and a little village that had like 60% unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had seen a sewing machine in their lives before. And we had to basically hire 500 people and teach them how to make suits.
Right.
And it really was a process, like literally from going from an empty building that we built
Yeah.
to having a factory producing upwards of 600 suits a day,
Mm.
where we'd take a group of people every day and evaluate, and some would stay and some would not. And then we'd teach them a job
Mm-hmm.
until they got really good at that job. And then we'd teach them another job until they got really good at that job. And then we'd have them teach the next group of people the first job they learned. And
Mm-hmm.
you roll this forward, and naturally certain people emerge as better at many things. And then that's where you find your leadership and your future supervisors and things. But that's really, and it's funny because I was talking to somebody who has a shoe shop in Los Angeles, and he operates exactly the same way. And you find eventually there are people who will learn all of it, and those are the people who end up running it.
Yeah. You know, I've always wondered what the difference is between someone who learns like through a traditional apprenticeship, like you have a master, you learn their way, their process, you get to work on the things they work on, you know, you get to see a limited scope, let's say. But there is still some weird richness to that, right? Because it's on a smaller scale, everything is more intense. Like your interaction with the two people around you may be a bit more intense, or the things you're working on, you have a bit more time to focus on. What would you say are the main differences between someone who's been taught traditionally in a small workshop versus someone who's been learning on the factory school, let's say, where everything is a larger scale, and kind of like the processes may change all the time? Because an old master may say, hey, I've been doing this since I was 20 and now I'm 70. But maybe a factory will say, look, this decade we're doing this, next decade we are going to work with scanners, and the decade after that we're all in the metaverse designing 3D models. So what do you think are the main differences there?
The benefit of learning in a factory scenario is repetition. If you learn the traditional apprenticeship way, where you make a coat start to finish, you've made a pocket once. If you learn in a factory, you're making pockets all day, every day, and then you quickly become very, very good and very quick at making pockets, but only a pocket. You don't have the holistic view. On the other hand, it's interesting because I believe you had a conversation with a colleague of mine. I brought him over from Europe, and I said, you're going to live in my house and work with me for a month, and I'm going to try to teach you as much as I can from my own experience in a month. And the benefit is that it's taken me 26 or 30 years to come to what I'm about to give you, and a lot of learning and a lot of experimentation, and a lot of mistakes and a lot of failures and a lot of stuff, and I'm going to hand it to you in a nice little package, and hopefully you'll take that package and add your own unique perspective and take on it. So you had better be better than me quickly. Take what I have known, which is finite, and add another element to it. Student exceeds the master, sort of thing. So in that environment, you're gaining the experience of that person and their failures and innovations, and then adding to it.
How do you think that works? And the reason why I ask that is, for example, if you and me would sit down and you would show me, for example, how to cut a canvas for a garment, right? You are not showing me how to cut a canvas in a garment at that point. You are showing me how to cut 20,000 canvases that you have cut in those 20 years, all compressed into one. So it's an extremely dense canvas for one garment. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
What I take over from you is just that one canvas. I don't get those 20,000 canvases that you've made and you've got in your mind. So then I kind of like have two routes. I'm like, okay, this guy has made 20,000 canvases, so this has to be really good, and I'm gonna really hold on to this tight, so that I make sure that I respect all that knowledge kind of like infused in me. But then there is also the other part which says, look, man, that guy has made 20,000 canvases. I haven't. So all the knowledge that person has is only going to be worth that one canvas that they're giving me. And it's really up to me to then go and learn another 50,000 canvases so that I have the same density. So do you think that the knowledge one acquires over many, many, many years and hands down to a person really allows someone to surpass them in the full sense, or does it just give them a good foundation to then start their own journey? And then the question is, if it's the latter, if it just gives them a good foundation to start the journey, then how much is the knowledge of a master really worth to a student? You know what I mean? I'm kind of like making a web here of a bit of a complex thing, but do you know what I mean?
So I think it depends on the master. I think it depends on whether the 20,000 canvases he's always made the same way,
Mm-hmm.
or whether he's made 5,000 this way and 5,000 that way and 5,000 another way,
Mm-hmm.
and can communicate, well, when I'm making it this way, it's because I want this effect, but I can also make it another way to get another effect. And here's different ways. And here's something I did for a very long time, and I struggled with it. And I eventually found a better way of doing it, so I can save you the struggle of doing it that way. Or I had certain challenges doing something else. You know, it depends on whether he's failed a lot, and to communicate the failure and the results of the experimentation and the research.
You mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that you had all these questions and you went to your dad for the answers, and he basically taught you how to think through your own answers. I really felt when I was doing my apprenticeship that there really wasn't, there was zero time spent with the apprentice in thinking through problems. And the main emphasis was just, look, learn the process and you automatically, magically will be able to kind of like go through some of the problems. Now, there is a very tiny, small amount of truth to that. If you have some form of a foundation, you can kind of like crawl your way through problems. But if you really are shown the process of thinking through unknowns, unknown unknowns, then you can, it doesn't matter what your foundation is, because you'll just be a cat. No matter how they throw you, you'll just land on your 4 feet. How do you think that the process of, let's say, kind of like technical thinking can be developed in the fullest sense with an apprentice, and can be encouraged above all? What would you say after all these years, having seen all these different garments and worked with all these different people? I'm sure you yourself as a technical thinker have had moments where you were like, how do they not see this in their minds? Can't they just like, flip this over that and then do this? And, how do we as tailors develop with the people around us, our apprentices and all of that, the skill of technical thinking?
It's funny. I wonder if Ruben actually mentioned that to you in your conversation, because one of the first things I told him when he came was that I could show you how I draft a sleeve, or I could show you how I draft a collar, which is the result of a lot of experimentation and a lot of study. But I'd rather show you my process. And so that's what we did. I said, okay, let's evaluate. This is how I make collar, because there's still a lot of stuff that I do that I've never fully explored and fully pulled on the thread of, like, let's dismantle this and see why, and see if there's a better way. So I said, welcome to my process. We're going to do things together, and you'll see how I'm going to evaluate, okay, is this way of making a 2-piece top collar the best way? Or let's make a bunch of collars and put them together and try things out. Or, no, I'm not getting the drape of the front of the sleeve I want, so I'm going to base the sleeve in 6, 12, 15 times until I get, and I will show you my process. So instead of me just showing you a recipe, you can go and apply that process and say, I want a particular result. How do I get there? Because I think more than anything, that was what helped me in my career, was just that process of discovery and experimentation. And some people are better at than others. And I've also been of the mindset that if I think I know something, instead of trying to prove it to myself, I try to disprove it.
Disprove it. Yeah.
If you can throw everything you can at it to try to prove that you're wrong, and you still can't prove you're wrong, you're probably right. But maybe not. There's still a chance you could be wrong. And that's another one of my big things is like, and somebody else said it better than I would, and I wish I could remember exactly how he said it. I was watching a video about illustration, and he said, you've got to practice, do it, and post it online, and post it to forums. But don't listen to the people who tell you it's good. Only listen to the people who tell you it's crap. Because as soon as you're happy, as soon as you think you're good, you get complacent and you stop improving. You have to never be happy with where you're at. You have to constantly want to be better and constantly push yourself to be better. And I absolutely believe that. Never think you're right. Never think you're done. Never think. But that's, in a sense that I had been asked to write textbooks about tailoring a number of times. And I was hesitated because I said, with any luck, 5 years from now, I will think that everything I know today will be completely wrong. So if I write a textbook today, in 5 years, I will say, I was so full of shit, everything's wrong. Until I started trying to learn 3D modeling, and every tutorial on the internet is completely off because they've changed the interface 4 times since the video was written. So I thought, well, maybe tailoring doesn't advance that as quickly. So maybe it's time to write a book or do a video series or something.
Are you planning to write a book?
I don't know if a book. I was initially thinking a book. I think video is more the better. It's easier to communicate things. It's easier to show. So, will it be a series of videos? I think so. I always said it was a project I would do when I retired, but I'm probably not going to retire. I'm going to die working, and so.
Well, if you would reach the age of retirement, we would then see your videos probably in the metaverse or beyond. So, so you're fairly young, so it's going to take a while then. What if someone would ask you, Jeffrey, what do you think are 3 important skills for me to develop to really become a technical thinker so that I approach my work really like an open-minded engineer, and with every product that I kind of like produce, I become a more knowledgeable person, a more creative person, and at the same time manage to kind of like transfer that knowledge into something that others can benefit from. What 3 skills would you highlight?
I wouldn't personally, because I don't claim to be the best technical thinker. But I would say I saw an ad for a masterclass recently. The internet, the masterclass site. Yes. And it was somebody who managed to put into words very eloquently and very well things that I had thought about for 25 years and just sort of encapsulated it in 30 seconds. I went, yes, this. So I wouldn't tell you 3 things. I would say, go look up Neil deGrasse Tyson on Masterclass. I still don't know enough about him, or so it's one of those things where I've said, I got to sit down and watch, I've got to sit down and read his things or whatever. But what he said spoke to me about exactly that, about technical thinking.
Does he say the trick is to know enough about the subject to know something, I don't know, but then to know enough to then say, I don't know enough, something like that? It's
possibly, but he said a lot of the things, and things like I have always said about try to prove yourself wrong, or try to, how to think about these things, how to, there is also a course at MIT that they're now offering online about design thinking. Right. Like it's just different ways of thinking about things. Well, okay, so here, no, I take that back. If you're going to do one thing, travel the world. Go to places, go to Burma. Go to somewhere weird that they're still not westernized, and go live with the people. Don't live in a hotel. It's really shocking the first time you go live in a very distinct culture to realize that there are other people out there who may look like you or not, may seem, they're human beings, and we all sort of, it was amazing how I became aware of the thought that I thought that everybody would think or act, or we'd have this real common sort of way of thinking or being or living, and it's not true. And being exposed to different cultures and how they think differently about things, and you go, wow, it can really shake you to the core. And I think that was really good for me to think that maybe I'm not right about this. Maybe we take this for granted, or we think that we're absolutely right about X, and maybe it's not true.
Do you see yourself as a tailor, or how do you see yourself professionally?
Good question. I mean, I suppose it's funny because when I mentioned that episode where the ladies came in to where I was working 25 years ago and saw me sewing a suit and said, "Oh, you're a tailor." And I said, "Well, I guess. I mean, I'm making a suit, so does that make me a tailor?" I guess so. So also back then, my goal one day was to be the head of, well, we call them designers in the industry, and that's an outdated term because now people think of designers as something else. But back then, the guy who made the patterns and told the factory how to sew and did all this stuff was the designer. And my goal was to be the designer at either Samuelson or Hickey Freeman someday. And now here I am at both. And so it's provoked this period of, now what? What's next? And just thinking about what I want to do with the next 20 years of my life. Am I still doing this? And what is this exactly that I'm doing? And what do I see myself as? So it's, I've been going through an existential discovery lately. So sorry to get all meta.
No, that's
really,
okay.
When you say what are you, it's like that's a really loaded question.
No, well, you see, so I've thought about this for myself, and I don't have the many years of professional experience that you have, but I'm still in the beginning of my career, really. But I thought, am I really a tailor? And then I'm like, yes, well, I do tailoring every day, but I'm not really the tailor that you would think of when you describe tailoring, the sense that I'm just making suits, because I tend to try to kind of like think about, okay, what role does tailoring play in society? If tailors would feel some sort of an honor from the public point of view, why would they feel kind of like honorable because of their profession? So I think about it from that aspect. I think about, what the hell are we doing when we are making stuff? Because, we're not making stuff just by producing something material, but something internal is also happening, My dad told me something interesting. He's a painter, and he said one day I was painting, and it was like a summer afternoon, and I had the window open next to me, and I was painting this tree, and then I heard this crow from outside. And he said for 1 second, just like very quickly, I felt as if, because he was very close to the painting and it was a big painting, he said, I felt as if I was in the painting and the sound came from within the painting. And I thought that is weird, So you're connecting to something that you don't understand probably. And I guess I have that with tailoring, because, what am I doing when I'm making a shoulder pad? I'm kind of like doing so many things. You're building algorithms. That describing every point of decision it can become like, an endless book almost of processes that all happen in 1 second, Then I'm like, boy, I'm also a bit of an engineer, because, I tend to have the approach of, okay, I'm not going to just stick to a process. So I don't know if I'm a tailor or I'm an engineer or I'm a designer or I'm a thinker or whatsoever yet.
Well, what is a tailor? Is it the guy who hems your pants at a dry cleaner?
Yeah,
Or is
that's a
it
good one.
Duncan
Yeah.
Quinn that has a shop that makes clothes, but he doesn't sew a button on? Or is it,
Yeah.
what really is a tailor?
I don't know. I really don't know. And I think one of the reasons why, at least from my perspective, why tailoring has kind of like hasn't become an industry that you can compare to sports or athletics, or film or music or whatsoever, is that it's not very clear what a tailor is, apart from the obvious things that people usually don't want to associate with. If I go to Savile Row and I'm like, hey, you guys are the same tailors as the dry cleaners, respect to the dry cleaners, of course, but they're going to be like, no, they're going to be offended. But if I would say to someone at the dry cleaners, hey, you're a tailor, Savile Row, really good stuff, and they're going to be maybe like, they feel elevated. So it's like, well, you're kind of like doing the same thing. But here's a question I have, and then I'll do a speed round with you and I'll wrap it up. So there is a quote from Bruce Lee, and I really like this quote. And it said, and he's apparently he says, I'm not afraid of the person who knows 1,000 kicks or 10,000 kicks. I'm afraid of the person who knows one kick but has practiced it 10,000 times. So you being someone who understands the process of repetition, but also being someone who understands the process of experimentation, which one speaks more to you? Which one do you think is in general more valuable in one's career?
Probably repetition.
Repetition.
For the same reason he said, if you can do 15 things poorly,
Mm-hmm.
or do one thing masterfully,
Mm-hmm.
I would rather do one thing masterfully than 15 things poorly.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay. Shall we do a speed round?
Sure.
All right. Okay. So, most influential person.
What, in general, to me?
In your career.
Leonard Bjorklund.
Okay. And was this the same person who said
No.
Okay.
No, but that person earns points for that too.
Okay. What's your current source of inspiration? Biggest source of inspiration?
For better, for worse, Instagram.
Instagram, really? So what? This is interesting. So why? Tell me.
Partly because I live in Rochester, New York, and there's just not shops and there's not stuff, so I don't get to see stores and see things and see people. In fact, Instagram can be terrible because I'll see things that I like and that inspire me, or go, God, I wish I could do this, and I try to do it and I try to do it and I can't. But you don't know how much they've pinned up the dummy behind it, and you don't know how much is Photoshop. You don't. Where I would charge my batteries twice a year is going to Italy for either Pitti or Idia Biella or one of these shows, and just sit in one of those sidewalk cafes and just watch people. And watch their clothes and see what they wear and how they wear it, and a speed round.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Tradition. Yeah.
Where's the question?
Oh, that's it. Tradition. So first thing that comes up your mind if you hear tradition.
Again, there's a German quote that I'm trying to remember and I can't, but it was something to do with not venerating the ashes, but and knowing the things that came before you in order for you to go to new places or something. I'm quite inarticulate when I speak, but tradition is a very important thing to me. not to cleave to, but to serve as a basis and a foundation.
Got it. The future of Bespoke.
Right.
Right. The best garment you ever unpicked.
Yeah. It was factory made. I'm sorry to say. In fact, there's a couple of them. But one of the factories is now closed, sadly. The other one is in Fano, called St. Andrews.
And can you briefly describe what it was that impressed you so much that you would say is one of the best garments you unpicked?
There was an article published in 1932, I think, which talked about hand tailoring, and it talks a lot about, there's a lot of mediocre hand sewing, and so is mediocre hand sewing better than good machine sewing? Machines have made things very consistent and very good and very even. Things that are handmade very often are not, and sometimes that's the appeal. I've very, very rarely seen things done with hand stitching that was so consistent it almost approaches machine stitching.
Wow.
And so I can think of a few garments, a couple jackets and a shirt that I own. Like 2 shirts.
That is a very interesting thing, because tailors do have something kind of like a natural resistance towards things that are machine made. It kind of like disgusts them, right? It's like, yeah, get that machine made bastard out of my way. But however, they do try to reach machine level precision, including myself, with hand sewing. And I think this is where it gets weird. You're trying, it's almost as if you're trying to become that thing that you hate the most. You know what I mean? It's a very strange thing, and I don't know what to do with it. But okay. The role of tailors in society.
So our clothes can be very important to us, and suits especially, because suits we associate with formal events, whether it's work or weddings or funerals or things. And so tailors provide a means of expressing oneself and covering oneself for some of the most important events in our life.
When you wear something for an occasion, do you feel that occasion more than you would if you would be appropriately dressed, but not really dressed for the occasion? Do you feel that?
Absolutely. You connect to the occasion, you connect to the people. It's a sign of respect of the occasion and of the people around you.
That's I have to think about that. This is a very interesting thing. Okay, the most difficult thing in tailoring for you?
Some of these flimsy, lightweight, 220 gram, 1x2 fabrics that just don't take a shape or behave themselves.
And would you see that more from a construction aspect or a cutting aspect?
Both.
Both. Okay.
But more construction.
What are you learning today? What is it that you would say, I'm in this year, this is what I'm mainly learning?
In general or in tailoring?
In general, man. In general, what is Jeffrey learning nowadays? If we would be classmates and I'm like, hey man, what are you learning today? Or what's your main what keeps you busy in your
drafting? How to create patterns for bodies, how to rethink about how we draft patterns for bodies. how we analyze the shape of the body in order to create a two-dimensional pattern that will eventually clothe that body. I'm going through an entire paradigm shift in terms of how that's done and how things are measured. And
Okay. Savile Row.
Sorry?
Savile Row.
It's very important. It's very important to the tradition and heritage of our craft. It's fortunate that they haven't forgotten it, that they still know it. Like it's very unfortunate that the company here, Hickey Freeman, has forgotten its heritage. But like many who reach a pinnacle, and I suppose that guy's comments about, illustration and never get complacent can be directed at Savile Row. They themselves, I think, became complacent. They knew that they were the best in the world, and they didn't advance, and they didn't innovate, and they didn't move as fast as some of the others. And that's why there's a lot of tailor shops in Italy that are far better than the ones in Savile Row, because they listened to the admirers and not the haters. And like it or not, and I know for a fact that half of the people on Savile Row hate me and the other half like me. Part of it's because, apparently Angus Cundy was not even aware that they were pad stitching their lapels by machine until I opened up a Henry Poole jacket and showed it on the internet and caused a bit of a commotion.
I have seen that post on your blog. Well, last but not least, how would you describe yourself in one word if you had to?
Researcher.
Awesome, man. Hey, thank you so much. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. You've inspired me with your approach in the very first year of me starting tailoring, and the fact that I saw someone question everything in a way that a researcher would do has been very, very beneficial to the development of my craft. So thank you for the time you've spent with me today, and I look forward to part 2.
I'd love to do it. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
And that was Jeffrey. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. If you'd like to get in touch with Jeffrey or you'd like to see more of him, check out the links to his Instagram, website, and blog in the description of this video. If you have any thoughts, comments, or anything else you'd like to mention, please let us know, and we sure hope to see you again in the next episode. Until then, bye-bye.